I sat on the cold bench at Grand Central Station for 4 agonizing hours, shivering as my breath fogged the winter air, watching trains pull away one after another, but none of them were coming back for me. I felt invisible, abandoned by the boy I raised. My own son had forgotten me, as if I were nothing more than a stray coat tossed aside. The worst part wasn't the cold or the waiting, it was realizing that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't forgotten at all. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Martha. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a small apartment in Queens, New York. The walls are painted a faded yellow that once seemed cheerful but now just looks tired, like everything else in my life. My days have become an endless loop of doctor appointments, the constant hum of my neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls, and meals I prepare for one while the city bustles outside my window, indifferent to my existence. That December afternoon was supposed to be simple. James, my son, had called me 3 days earlier. His voice carried that familiar tone, the one that made my heart flutter with hope despite everything that had happened before. "Mom, let's meet at Grand Central," he'd said. "I want to take you Christmas shopping. Like we used to do when I was little." I remember how my hands trembled as I hung up the phone. For the first time in months, someone wanted to spend time with me. Someone remembered I existed. I spent an hour getting ready that morning. I put on my best wool coat, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that my late husband David had bought me 15 years ago. I applied lipstick with shaking fingers, the same coral shade I'd worn on our first date. I even sprayed a hint of the perfume David used to love, though the bottle was nearly empty now. The subway ride to Manhattan felt different that day. I watched the other passengers, young mothers with strollers, businessmen in expensive suits, teenagers with their faces buried in phones, and for once, I didn't feel like a ghost among them. I had somewhere to be. Someone was waiting for me. When I arrived at Grand Central, the magnificent ceiling stretched above me like a painted sky. Tourists snapped photos while commuters rushed past, everyone with purpose, everyone belonging somewhere. I found our meeting spot near the information booth and checked my watch. I was 10 minutes early, but that was fine. I wanted to savor this moment. 1 hour passed. Then 2. My feet began to ache in my good shoes. The December wind whistled through the station, and I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. I called James twice. Both times, it went straight to voicemail. "Hi, honey, it's Mom. I'm here at the station. Are you running late?" The first message was cheerful, understanding. The second, an hour later, carried just a hint of worry. "James, it's me again. I'm still waiting. Please call me back." By the third hour, I stopped calling. The hope that had carried me through the morning began to curdle in my stomach, turning into something bitter and familiar. Around me, the station grew quieter as rush hour ended. The coffee cart nearby began closing up, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. That's when I saw them, a young couple saying goodbye. The woman was crying softly as the man kissed her forehead before boarding his train. Even in their sadness, they had each other. They had love that mattered enough to cry over. I sat there watching love in all its forms. Parents embracing children returning from college. Friends meeting after long separations. Couples reuniting after business trips. Everyone had someone who cared enough to show up, to be present, to keep promises. Everyone except me. The 4th hour was the longest. My phone battery died, and I didn't have a charger. The station's warmth couldn't reach the coldness that had settled in my bones, not from the weather, but from the growing certainty that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't traffic or an emergency or a misunderstood time. This was abandonment wrapped in the thin excuse of forgetfulness. When I finally gave up and made my way home on the subway, my reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger. My carefully applied lipstick had worn off from nervous lip biting. My hair, styled so hopefully that morning, hung limp around my face. But it was my eyes that shocked me most. They looked hollow, defeated, like I'd aged a decade in those 4 hours. The keys felt heavy in my hand as I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment. My body ached from the cold bench, from the disappointment, from the weight of another broken promise. I pushed open the door, expecting to find the familiar silence of my empty home. Instead, I heard the soft clicking of keyboard keys. My heart stopped. There was James, sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop open in front of him. The screen glowed blue in the afternoon light filtering through my thin curtains. He looked up when I walked in, and for a split second, I saw something flash across his face, not guilt, not embarrassment, but annoyance. Like I was interrupting something important. "Oh, hey Mom," he said, his voice too casual, too rehearsed. "Sorry about today. Something came up at work. Emergency meeting, you know how it is." But I wasn't listening to his words. My eyes were fixed on the screen. I could see it clearly from where I stood. My online banking portal was open. Numbers glowed on the screen. My numbers. My account balances. My life savings displayed like items in a store window. The smell hit me then, his cologne mixed with the stale coffee I'd left on the counter that morning. It was a scent I should have found comforting, familiar. Instead, it made my stomach turn. How long had he been here? How long had he been going through my private information while I sat freezing on that bench, believing he cared enough to keep a promise? What are you doing? The words came out as barely a whisper. He closed the laptop with a soft snap. Just helping you organize some bills, Mom. You mentioned last week that you were confused about your bank statements. I had never mentioned any such thing. The room seemed to tilt around me. This was my son. The baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd promised to take care of me when I got old. This was the man I'd sacrificed everything for, standing in my kitchen, lying to my face while my personal information reflected in his eyes. Have you ever had a moment when everything you believed about your life suddenly shifted? When the ground beneath your feet revealed itself to be nothing more than shifting sand? That's what happened to me in that instant, in my own kitchen, staring at my own son. I thought about all the times I'd given him money. All the times I'd believed his stories about temporary setbacks, business opportunities, emergency expenses. All the times I'd chosen to trust him instead of the small voice in my head that whispered warnings I didn't want to hear. But this was different. This wasn't asking. This wasn't even lying. This was taking. This was stealing from the woman who'd given him everything. Let me tell you about that everything. About the years of sacrifice that led to this moment of betrayal. When David died 10 years ago, my world collapsed. We'd been married for 38 years, and suddenly I was alone with a grief so profound it felt like drowning in an endless ocean. James was 32 then, already struggling with what he called financial challenges, but what I was beginning to understand were the consequences of poor choices and expensive habits. Don't worry about me, Mom, he'd said at the funeral, his arm around my shaking shoulders. I'll take care of you now. That's what Dad would have wanted. Those words became the foundation of the next decade of my life. I clung to them like a prayer, repeated them to myself in the dark hours when grief threatened to swallow me whole. My son would take care of me. I wouldn't be alone. But taking care of me, I discovered, meant something different to James than it did to me. The first request came 3 months after the funeral. I was still wearing black most days, still crying at unexpected moments when a song on the radio or the smell of David's aftershave caught me off guard. Mom, I hate to ask, but I'm in a really tight spot, James said over dinner at the small restaurant where we'd started meeting every Sunday. My business partner screwed me over, and I need $5,000 to keep the company afloat. Just for a few weeks. I'll pay you back with interest. $5,000 was a significant amount from David's life insurance money, but James explained it so clearly. He had charts and projections on his phone. He talked about investments and returns and how this temporary setback would lead to long-term success. He looked so confident, so sure of himself. More than that, he needed me. For the first time since David's death, someone needed me for something important. Of course, honey, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Family takes care of family. The money was never repaid. 2 months later, another emergency. This time it was $8,000 for equipment his company desperately needed. 6 months after that, $12,000 for a sure-thing investment opportunity that would double our money in 3 months. Each time, the story was compelling. Each time, James had documents and explanations and promises. Each time, I believed him because the alternative, that my own son was lying to me, using me, stealing from me, was too painful to consider. Do you know what it's like to choose delusion over truth because the truth is too devastating to bear? I do. I lived in that choice for years. My financial advisor, a kind man named Mr. Peterson who'd helped David and me manage our modest savings, began expressing concern. Martha, I noticed some unusual withdrawals from your accounts, he said during a meeting about 6 months after James's first loan. Large cash amounts. Are you making some investments I should know about? I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. It's just family finances. Nothing to worry about. But Mr. Peterson's expression told me he was worried. Very worried. Martha, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've seen too many seniors become victims of financial exploitation. Even by family members. Especially by family members. His words stung like a slap. My son isn't exploiting me. He's building a business. He's going to pay me back. Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, but I could see he didn't believe me. I hope you're right. But if you need to talk, if you need help, please call me. I never called. The requests continued. Sometimes they came during our Sunday dinners, James's voice carefully casual as he explained his latest crisis. Sometimes they arrived as frantic phone calls in the middle of the night, emergencies that couldn't wait, opportunities that would disappear if we didn't act immediately. I gave him $15,000 for a down payment on equipment for a catering business that never materialized. $20,000 for an investment in cryptocurrency that he swore would make us both wealthy. $35,000 to help him avoid bankruptcy when his various ventures collapsed. Over 3 years, I gave my son nearly $90,000 from David's life insurance money and our retirement savings. $90,000 that disappeared into promises and excuses and increasingly elaborate explanations for why repayment would have to wait just a little longer. But it wasn't just the money, though the money was devastating enough. It was the way James began to change toward me as my bank account shrank and his needs grew larger. Where once he'd been attentive and grateful, he became dismissive and impatient. Our Sunday dinners grew shorter. His phone calls became less frequent. When I called him, he often seemed distracted, eager to end the conversation. "Mom, I can't talk right now," became his default response to my attempts at connection. When I got sick with pneumonia that winter, I called James from the hospital emergency room. I was scared and alone, hooked up to machines in a sterile room that smelled like disinfectant and despair. "I'm at the hospital, honey," I whispered into the phone. "Could you come? I don't want to be alone." "What hospital?" he asked, but I could hear the television in the background. When I told him, there was a long pause. "Mom, that's really far from where I am right now. And I have this work thing. Are you sure you need me there? The doctors will take good care of you." I spent that night alone, listening to the beeping of machines and the distant voices of nurses in the hallway. James never came. When I was discharged 3 days later, weak and still coughing, I took a taxi home to my empty apartment. There were no flowers waiting, no concerned phone calls, no offers to help with groceries or medications. But 2 weeks later, James called with another emergency. Another opportunity. Another request for money. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This was the same person who claimed to love me, who said family was the most important thing, who promised to take care of me. Yet when I truly needed care, when I was vulnerable and frightened, he was nowhere to be found. But when he needed money, he was immediately available, full of charm and explanations and promises that everything would be different once this current crisis was resolved. I began to understand that I had become an ATM machine to my own son. A resource to be tapped when needed and ignored when inconvenient. The worst part was how skillfully he made me feel guilty for even questioning him. "Mom, I'm disappointed that you don't trust me," he'd say when I hesitated to transfer funds. "After everything I'm trying to build for our future, you act like I'm some kind of criminal." Or, "I guess I was wrong to think I could count on family. Maybe I should just declare bankruptcy and move across the country. Would that make you happy?" These conversations left me feeling confused and selfish. Was I being unreasonable? Was I failing as a mother by not supporting my son's dreams? The manipulation was so subtle, so expertly applied, that I often ended up apologizing to him and offering more money than he'd originally requested. My daughter Sarah, who lived in California with her own family, began noticing changes during our weekly phone calls. "Mom, you sound tired," she said one evening. "Are you taking care of yourself?" I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain about James and the money and the growing fear that I was being used by my own child. But Sarah had her own life, her own problems. Her husband had been laid off, and they were struggling to keep up with their mortgage and their children's college expenses. Besides, James was her brother. How could I poison that relationship with my suspicions and fears? What if I was wrong? What if James really was just going through a difficult period and I was being paranoid and untrusting? "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told Sarah. "Just getting older, you know how it is." But I wasn't fine. I was disappearing, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, lie by lie. My social life, never robust to begin with, dwindled to almost nothing. I stopped going to the senior center because I couldn't afford the small membership fee. I canceled my subscription to the community theater because $30 a month seemed like an extravagance when James had so many pressing needs. I began buying generic groceries and skipping meals to save money. I wore the same clothes for days at a time to reduce laundry costs. I kept my apartment uncomfortably cold in winter and stifling hot in summer to minimize utility bills. Also, I could be ready for James's next crisis, his next opportunity, his next request for funds I increasingly couldn't afford to give. The irony was crushing. I was impoverishing myself to support a son who never asked about my financial security, who never wondered if his constant requests were causing me hardship, who never seemed to notice that I was getting thinner and quieter and sadder. Or maybe he did notice. Maybe he just didn't care. That thought, when it first occurred to me, was so devastating that I pushed it away immediately. Children don't deliberately harm their parents. Sons don't knowingly exploit their mothers. James loved me. He was just struggling, going through a rough patch. He'd figure things out eventually, and then everything would be fine, wouldn't it? The questions I pushed down during the day had a way of surfacing at night, when I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city that never sleeps. In those dark hours, honesty crept in like cold air through a broken window. When was the last time James had asked about my health? When had he last remembered my birthday without prompting? When had he last offered to help me with anything, groceries, doctor appointments, home repairs, without being asked? When was the last time he'd simply called to say hello, with no financial emergency to report, no crisis to solve, no money to request? I couldn't remember. The realization was more painful than any physical injury I'd ever endured. But still, I held on. Still, I hoped. Still, I answered his calls and opened my wallet and chose to believe that someday, somehow, things would be different. Until that day at Grand Central Station. Until I came home to find him at my computer, his fingers dancing across my keyboard, my private financial information glowing on the screen like secrets exposed to sunlight. That was the moment when hope finally died. That was when the truth became impossible to deny. My son wasn't struggling. My son wasn't going through a rough patch. My son wasn't building a business or making investments or facing temporary setbacks. My son was stealing from me. Systematically, deliberately, without conscience or remorse. And I had been his willing victim for years. Standing in my kitchen that December afternoon, staring at James as he calmly lied about helping me organize bills I'd never complained about, I felt something break inside me. Not my heart, that had been broken and mended so many times it was more scar tissue than muscle now. What broke was my willingness to be deceived. For the first time in years, I saw my son clearly. Not through the lens of maternal love or desperate hope or willful blindness. I saw him as he actually was, a middle-aged man who had discovered that his aging mother was an easy target, a renewable resource, a solution to problems he was too lazy or selfish to solve himself. The ceramic mug I'd been holding slipped from my trembling fingers. It hit the kitchen floor with a sharp crack, breaking into 3 neat pieces. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence between us. James looked at the broken mug, then at me. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not guilt, not shame, but calculation. He was already formulating his next move, his next explanation, his next manipulation. "Mom, are you okay? You look a little pale. Maybe you should sit down." Even then, even caught red-handed with his metaphorical fingers in my digital wallet, he was trying to control the narrative. Trying to make me doubt my own perceptions, my own reality. But something had shifted. Some essential piece of my willingness to be victimized had broken along with that mug. "Get out," I said quietly. James blinked, startled. In all our years of this toxic dance, I had never asked him to leave. I had never refused a request, never questioned a story, never stood up for myself in any meaningful way. "What? Get out of my apartment. Get out now." He stood slowly, closing my laptop with deliberate care. "Mom, I think you're having some kind of episode. You're not making sense." The gaslighting was immediate and automatic. I was confused, I was irrational, I was having an episode. The problem wasn't his behavior, the problem was my perception of his behavior. But for once, the manipulation didn't work. For once, I trusted what I had seen with my own eyes over what he wanted me to believe. "I'm making perfect sense," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You came here while I was waiting for you at the train station. You went through my personal finances without permission. You lied to me about where you were. I want you to leave." James's face cycled through a series of expressions: surprise, annoyance, calculation, and finally, a cold anger I'd never seen before. "Fine," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of my kitchen chair. "But don't come crying to me when you can't figure out your online banking and end up with your account frozen or something." Even as he left, he was planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that I needed him, that I couldn't manage my own affairs without his help. The door slammed behind him with a finality that seemed to shake the entire building. And then I was alone. Truly alone, in a way I hadn't been since David's death. But this loneliness felt different. This wasn't the absence of love, this was the presence of truth. I bent to pick up the pieces of my broken mug. It had been a gift from Sarah years ago, painted with cheerful sunflowers and the words, "World's Greatest Mom." As I held the fragments, I wondered if I had been a good mother at all. Good mothers don't raise children who steal from them. Good mothers don't enable and excuse and facilitate their own exploitation. Or maybe good mothers do exactly that. Maybe love makes us vulnerable in ways that bad people, even bad people we've raised and nurtured and sacrificed for, will always exploit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my narrow bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, staring at my bank account information. For the first time in years, I was looking at my finances not as a resource for James's crises, but as my own life's work, my own security, my own future, my own survival. The numbers were worse than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. My savings were nearly depleted. My monthly Social Security payments barely covered my rent and utilities. If I had any more major expenses, a medical emergency, a necessary home repair, even a modest increase in my cost of living, I would be in serious trouble. I had given my son $90,000 over 3 years, and I had nothing to show for it but a collection of broken promises and a growing certainty that I had been played for a fool by the person I loved most in the world. But recognizing the problem wasn't the same as knowing how to fix it. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. Years of putting James's needs before my own had created patterns of behavior that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. What if he really was in trouble? What if he needed me and I turned my back on him? What if this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a calm conversation and some reasonable boundaries? These thoughts circled my mind like vultures, picking at my newfound resolve. By morning, I was exhausted and confused and wondering if maybe I had overreacted. Maybe James really had been trying to help with my finances. Maybe I should call him and apologize. But when I reached for my phone, I remembered something that stopped me cold. I remembered how he'd looked when I walked into my apartment the day before. Not guilty. Not embarrassed. Not caught in the act of doing something wrong. Annoyed. He'd looked annoyed that I'd interrupted him. A man who was innocently helping his mother with her finances would have looked pleased to see her. He would have greeted her warmly, explained what he was doing, asked about her day at the train station. A man who was stealing from his mother would look exactly the way James had looked, irritated by an unexpected interruption to his criminal activity. That's a hard truth to accept about someone you love. That's a truth that changes everything about your relationship, your history, your future. But it was my truth. And for the first time in years, I decided to honor it instead of denying it. I didn't call James. Instead, I called my bank. I need to change all my passwords and security information, I told the customer service representative. I'm concerned that someone may have accessed my account without permission. The woman on the phone was kind and efficient. She walked me through the process of securing my accounts, setting up new passwords, establishing additional security protocols. She never asked who I was protecting my money from, but her tone suggested she understood that financial exploitation of elderly people was more common than anyone wanted to admit. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: control over my own life. It was a small step, but it was mine. For the first time since David's death, I had taken action to protect myself instead of waiting for someone else to rescue me or betray me. The phone rang 3 hours later. James. I stared at his name on the screen, my finger hovering over the answer button. Part of me wanted to pick up, to hear his voice, to pretend that yesterday hadn't happened. The habit of responding to his needs was so deeply ingrained that ignoring his call felt like holding my breath underwater. But I let it ring. And then I let it ring again when he called back 2 minutes later. The third time he called, I turned off my phone. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a peaceful evening or the temporary stillness between conversations. It was the profound silence that comes when you stop participating in your own destruction. I made myself a cup of tea, in a new mug, since my sunflower one was broken, and sat by my window looking out at the streets of Queens. People walked by with purpose, carrying shopping bags and briefcases and children. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, what they were doing, what mattered to them. For the first time in years, I began to wonder what mattered to me. When David was alive, my days had structure and meaning. We took care of each other, shared responsibilities, made decisions together. We had routines and traditions and plans for the future. After he died, James had gradually filled that void, becoming the organizing principle of my life. His needs determined my decisions. His crises shaped my priorities. His demands gave my days purpose, even if that purpose was slowly destroying me. Now, with that destructive purpose removed, I was faced with a question I hadn't considered in a decade. What did I want to do with the time I had left? The question should have been liberating. Instead, it was terrifying. I was 72 years old, isolated from friends I'd neglected in favor of James's drama, financially damaged by years of exploitation, and completely out of practice at living for myself. But I was also free. For the first time in a decade, I was free to make choices based on my own needs, my own desires, my own judgment. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed up for no reason other than that I wanted to feel good about myself. I put on the blue dress David had always complimented, applied makeup carefully, and walked to the small cafe 3 blocks from my apartment. I ordered coffee and a pastry, an indulgence I'd denied myself for months while saving money for James's next crisis, and sat by the window watching the neighborhood wake up. It was a Tuesday morning in December, and the world was going about its business without requiring anything from me. It was wonderful. A woman about my age was sitting at the next table, reading a paperback novel and sipping tea. When she looked up, our eyes met, and she smiled. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Eleanor." I don't think I've seen you here before. Martha, I said. I live nearby, but I don't get out much. Eleanor nodded knowingly. I understand. I went through a period like that after my husband died. It's easy to become invisible, isn't it? Her words hit me like a gentle slap. Invisible. That's exactly what I'd become, not just to James, who had reduced me to a walking ATM, but to myself. I'd stopped seeing my own life as valuable, my own needs as legitimate, my own happiness as worth pursuing. Yes, I said quietly. It is. Eleanor and I talked for an hour. She was a retired social worker who had spent her career helping families navigate crises. She was also a widow, someone who understood the particular challenges of building a life alone after decades of partnership. The hardest part, she told me, is remembering that you're still a person with your own value, even when there's no one around to remind you of that every day. When I finally went home, I felt lighter somehow. A simple conversation with a stranger had reminded me that I existed apart from my role as James's mother, apart from my function as his financial resource. But my phone was full of missed calls and increasingly frantic voicemails. Mom, what's going on? I've been trying to reach you for hours. Mom, this is ridiculous. Call me back. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I need to talk to you. It's important. Fine, if you want to be childish about this, that's your choice. But don't blame me when you need my help and I'm not available. The messages charted a familiar progression from confusion to anger to manipulation. James was working through his standard playbook, trying to find the emotional button that would bring me back into compliance. In the past, any one of these messages would have sent me into a panic. I would have called him immediately, apologized profusely for whatever I'd done wrong, and agreed to whatever he needed to make things right. But sitting in my kitchen, listening to his increasingly desperate messages, I felt something new: clarity. These weren't the messages of a loving son concerned about his mother's welfare. These were the communications of someone whose ATM had gone offline, and he needed to get it working again as quickly as possible. I deleted all the messages without responding. That evening, Sarah called from California. Her voice was tight with concern. Mom, James called me. He's really worried about you. He says you're acting strange, not answering your phone, saying weird things. My heart sank. Of course James had called Sarah. Of course he was trying to triangulate, to use my daughter's genuine concern as leverage against me. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I just needed some space to think about things. Mom, James said you accused him of stealing from you. That's a really serious accusation. Do you think maybe you're getting a little confused? It happens sometimes as we age. The suggestion that I was becoming senile, losing my mental faculties, was so hurtful that I almost hung up the phone. But I realized that Sarah wasn't trying to hurt me, she was trying to make sense of a situation that James had deliberately distorted. Sarah, I found your brother in my apartment, on my computer, with my banking information open on the screen. He was there while I waited for him at Grand Central Station for 4 hours. He never showed up for our date, and he never called to explain or apologize. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. That does sound bad, Sarah said slowly. But maybe there's an explanation. Maybe he was trying to help you with something. Without my permission? Without telling me? While leaving me stranded in the city. Another pause. I could almost hear Sarah's mind working, trying to reconcile her image of her brother as a caring son with the evidence of his behavior. Mom, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to talk to him? I want you to support my decision to protect myself. I've been giving your brother money for years, a lot of money, and he's never paid back a penny. I found him trying to access my accounts without permission. I have a right to be angry about that. How much money? Sarah's voice was suddenly very quiet. Nearly $90,000 over the past 3 years. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Mom, Sarah said finally, $90,000 that's almost all of your savings, isn't it? Yes. Oh, Mom. Her voice was full of pain and understanding. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was that much. I didn't know it was anything like that. Hearing Sarah's genuine distress, her immediate shift from skepticism to support, made me realize how much James's manipulation had isolated me even from my other child. He'd trained me to keep our financial arrangements secret, to treat his constant needs as private family business that shouldn't concern Sarah. He told me not to worry you with his problems, I said. He said it was between him and me, that you had enough stress in your own life. Mom, I'm your daughter. Your welfare is my concern, not a burden. You should have told me. Should have. Could have. Might have. If only I'd been brave enough, smart enough, strong enough to ask for help years ago. But I wasn't thinking clearly then. I was thinking like a victim, like someone whose primary value lay in her usefulness to other people. I was thinking like a woman who'd forgotten that her own life mattered. What do you want to do now? Sarah asked. For the first time in years, someone was asking what I wanted instead of telling me what I should give. I want him to stay away from me until he can treat me with respect, I said. I want him to stop taking my money. I want him to stop lying to me. That sounds completely reasonable, Sarah said. Do you think he'll do those things? It was a fair question. Did I think James would suddenly develop respect for me, honesty in his communications, and financial independence? Did I think a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of exploiting his mother would suddenly discover his conscience? No, I said. I don't think he will. Then maybe you need to protect yourself in other ways. Sarah and I talked for another hour. She offered to fly out to New York to help me, to be present for any difficult conversations with James, to provide emotional support during what she understood would be a painful process. For the first time in years, I felt like I had an ally. Someone who cared about my well-being, who believed my account of what had happened, who wanted to help me be safe and secure rather than available and useful. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, James appeared at my door. I saw him through the peephole, pacing back and forth in the hallway, checking his phone, running his hands through his hair. He looked agitated, desperate. He knocked politely at first. Then more insistently. Then he began calling through the door. Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Even now, even after being caught in the act of accessing my private financial information, he was reframing his behavior as a simple miscommunication. Mom, please. I can explain everything. Just let me in for 5 minutes. I stood on the other side of the door, my heart pounding, wondering if I had the strength to maintain my boundaries. It would be so easy to open the door, to let him in, to listen to his explanations and excuses and apologies. It would also be the first step back into the cycle that had consumed 3 years of my life and $90,000 of my savings. James, I said through the door, I'm not ready to talk to you yet. I need time to think. Think about what? Mom, you're acting crazy. I was trying to help you. I wasn't stealing anything. But I had seen what I had seen. I had lived what I had lived. And for the first time in years, I was choosing to trust my own experience over someone else's version of reality. Please leave, I said. When I'm ready to talk, I'll call you. The knocking stopped. I heard footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of the elevator doors closing. I slumped against my door, emotionally exhausted. Every instinct I'd developed over 72 years of life told me to chase after him, to apologize, to make things right. But a newer, smaller voice whispered that making things right might mean letting them stay wrong until James was ready to change his behavior. I spent the rest of that day doing something unprecedented. I focused entirely on myself. I cleaned my apartment thoroughly, not because anyone was coming to visit, but because I deserved to live in a space that was orderly and beautiful. I prepared a real meal for myself, not because I had company, but because I was worth the effort of proper nutrition. I even took a long bath with Epsom salts, something I'd denied myself for months as an unnecessary luxury. As I soaked in the warm water, I thought about the woman I'd been before David died, before James's crisis of the month became the organizing principle of my existence. I'd been active in community theater, volunteering with a literacy program at the library. I'd had hobbies and interests and opinions about things that had nothing to do with my children's needs. I'd been a person, not just a function. Over the following weeks, James's attempts to re-establish contact followed a predictable pattern. First came the angry phone calls, accusations that I was being unreasonable and hurtful. Then came the guilt trips, messages about how disappointed David would be in my behavior, how I was destroying our family over a simple misunderstanding. When anger and guilt didn't work, James switched to desperation. He was facing eviction. His business was collapsing. He needed $15,000 immediately or he'd be homeless by Christmas. In the past, any one of these crises would have sent me running to the bank. The thought of my son being homeless, sleeping in his car or in a shelter, would have been unbearable. I would have given him anything he needed, borrowed against my apartment if necessary, to prevent such a catastrophe. But I didn't run to the bank. Instead, I did something that would have seemed impossible just a month before. I called James's bluff. If you're really facing eviction, I told him during one of his desperate phone calls, I'll be happy to call your landlord directly and pay your rent. I'll also be glad to speak with your business partners about your financial situation. Just give me their contact information. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. If James were really facing the crises he described, he would have eagerly provided me with the information I requested. A desperate man would gratefully accept help from any source. But James wasn't desperate. James was lying. And when confronted with the possibility that his lies might be investigated, he quickly backtracked. Never mind, Mom. I figured something else out. No need to get other people involved. Of course he had figured something else out. He'd found another source of money, another victim to manipulate, another sympathetic relative or friend who believed his stories and opened their wallet. But it wasn't me. For the first time in 3 years, it wasn't me. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I had passed a test, not James's test of whether I would continue funding his lifestyle, but my own test of whether I could choose self-preservation over self-destruction. Eleanor and I began meeting regularly at the cafe. She became my anchor during those difficult weeks, reminding me that I had value beyond my usefulness to other people, that I deserved to be treated with respect and honesty. You know, she said one morning as we shared coffee and Danish pastries, I spent 30 years as a social worker helping families navigate these exact same issues. Financial exploitation of elderly parents by their adult children is more common than most people realize. Really? Oh yes. And it's particularly insidious because it's wrapped in the language of love and family obligation. The victims often don't recognize what's happening because the perpetrators are people they trust implicitly. Eleanor's professional insights helped me understand that what had happened to me wasn't unique, wasn't a reflection of my personal failures as a mother, and most importantly, wasn't my fault. The children who do this, Eleanor explained, are usually people who have never learned to solve problems independently. They've discovered that their parents' love and guilt can be weaponized to solve financial problems, and they become addicted to that easy solution. But how do they justify it to themselves? How do they sleep at night knowing they're taking advantage of someone who loves them? Eleanor stirred her coffee slowly. They create elaborate justifications. They tell themselves they're borrowing, not stealing. They convince themselves they'll pay it back someday. They blame their parents for being controlling or their circumstances for being unfair. But mostly, they just don't think about their parents as full human beings with their own needs and vulnerabilities. That last observation hit me like a physical blow. James didn't see me as a full human being. To him, I was a resource, a solution to problems, a means to an end. My feelings, my financial security, my dignity, none of that mattered as much as his immediate needs. Understanding that helped me maintain my boundaries when James escalated his manipulation tactics. The escalation began in February, 2 months after our confrontation in my kitchen. I hadn't spoken to him since the rent crisis phone call, and apparently my silence was becoming unbearable for him. He showed up at my apartment building with Sarah and her 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I hadn't seen in over a year. Through my peephole, I could see 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Michael shifting nervously in the hallway while their Uncle James knocked on my door. Sarah looked uncomfortable, like she'd been pressured into this visit. "Grandma Martha," Emma called through the door, "Uncle James says you're sick. Are you okay?" My heart broke. James was using my grandchildren as emotional leverage, manipulating their innocent concern to force a confrontation I wasn't ready for. I opened the door. Emma and Michael rushed to hug me, their small bodies warm and solid against my chest. For a moment, I forgot about everything else. These children loved me genuinely, without agenda or manipulation. Their hugs were freely given, not calculated to achieve a particular outcome. "I missed you so much, Grandma," Emma whispered. Behind the children, James stood with his arms crossed, a triumphant expression on his face. He thought he'd found the perfect weapon, my love for my grandchildren combined with their innocent manipulation. Sarah hung back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. When our eyes met, she mouthed, "I'm sorry." "Kids," Sarah said gently, "why don't you go play in Grandma's living room for a few minutes while the grown-ups talk?" Emma and Michael ran off to explore my small apartment, leaving the 3 adults standing in the awkward silence of my entryway. "This is ridiculous, Mom," James said without preamble. "You're punishing me for trying to help you, and now you're punishing Emma and Michael by refusing to see them. They think you don't love them anymore." The manipulation was breathtakingly skillful. In 2 sentences, James had reframed himself as the victim of my unreasonable behavior and positioned my grandchildren as casualties of my selfishness. "I haven't been refusing to see them," I said quietly. "You've never brought them before today. Because you've been acting crazy for 2 months. Because you've been making wild accusations and refusing to communicate like a rational person." Sarah stepped forward. "James, that's enough. Mom explained to me what happened. She has legitimate concerns about her finances, and she has every right to protect herself." James turned on his sister with surprising viciousness. "Oh, so now you're taking her side? She's turning you against me with her paranoid delusions." "They're not delusions," Sarah said firmly. "Mom showed me her bank statements. She's given you nearly $90,000 over the past 3 years. That's not helping, that's taking advantage." James's face flushed red. That money was investments. Business loans. She was going to make money on those deals. "What deals?" Sarah asked. "What businesses? Where are the contracts, the documentation, the repayment schedules?" For a moment, James looked like he might actually answer. Then his expression shifted to cold anger. I don't have to justify my business relationships to either of you. Mom offered to invest in my future, and I accepted her help. If she's having second thoughts now, that's her choice, but she doesn't get to retroactively call it theft. The audacity was stunning. Even confronted with clear evidence of his exploitation, James was redefining the narrative to cast himself as a legitimate business partner rather than a manipulative son. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been deceived by his stories for 3 years. I had clarity now, painful and complete. James, I said quietly, there were no investments. There were no business loans. There were no contracts or documentation or repayment schedules because you never intended to pay me back. You found stories that would make me feel guilty enough to give you money, and you kept using those stories until I stopped believing them. That's not true. Then show me the businesses. Show me the investments. Show me any evidence that the money I gave you was used for anything other than your personal expenses. James opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known him, he had no ready explanation, no convincing story, no deflection or excuse. I don't have to prove anything to you, he said finally. And there it was. The truth, stripped of all pretense and manipulation. He didn't have to prove anything to me because he'd never considered me worthy of proof. I was his mother, which meant I was obligated to support him regardless of his behavior or attitude. In the living room, I could hear Emma and Michael playing with the few toys I kept for their rare visits. Their laughter was bright and innocent, unmarked by the ugly adult drama playing out in my entryway. I want you to leave, I said to James. Sarah, you and the children are welcome to stay as long as you want, but I need James to go. You're really going to do this? James asked. You're going to choose money over family? It was his final manipulation, the nuclear option he'd been saving for just this moment. By reframing the conflict as my greed versus familial love, he was hoping to shame me back into compliance. But I understood now that the choice was exactly the opposite. James was the one who had chosen money over family. He was the one who had reduced our relationship to a series of financial transactions. He was the one who had poisoned the love between us with lies and manipulation and exploitation. I'm choosing respect over exploitation, I said. I'm choosing honesty over manipulation. I'm choosing to be treated like a human being instead of an ATM machine. James stared at me for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. Finally, he shook his head. Fine, he said. But don't expect me to come crawling back when you change your mind. And don't expect me to take care of you when you're too old to manage on your own. The threat was clear: continue supporting me financially, or face abandonment when you need care most. It should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of liberation. James had finally said out loud what had been implicit in our relationship for years, that his love and support were conditional on my financial compliance. I understand, I said. Goodbye, James. He left without saying goodbye to his niece and nephew, which told me everything about his priorities and character that I'd been refusing to see for years. After the door closed, Sarah and I looked at each other in the heavy silence of my entryway. I'm so sorry, she said. I shouldn't have brought the kids. I thought maybe if he saw them with you, he'd remember what family is supposed to be about. It's not your fault. James manipulated you the same way he's been manipulating me. Sarah started crying then, soft tears of frustration and grief. I keep thinking there must be something we can do to reach him, some way to make him understand what he's doing to our family. I hugged my daughter, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, grateful for this one relationship that wasn't poisoned by financial exploitation. Maybe someday he'll understand, I said. But I can't wait for that day while he destroys what's left of my security and dignity. We spent the afternoon together, Sarah and the children and me. We played board games and made cookies and watched old movies. For a few hours, I remembered what normal family relationships felt like, relationships based on affection rather than obligation, on presence rather than presence, on enjoying each other's company rather than solving each other's problems. When they left to catch their flight back to California, Emma hugged me tightly. Will you call me sometimes, Grandma? Even if Uncle James is being mean? Of course, sweetheart. I'll call you every week. Promise? Promise. It was a promise I kept. Every Sunday afternoon, I called Emma and Michael and spoke with them about school and friends and favorite books. Sarah made sure they understood that the conflict with their uncle had nothing to do with their relationship with me. Those weekly calls became bright spots in what were otherwise difficult months. I was learning to rebuild my life around my own needs and interests, but the process was lonely and sometimes frightening. Eleanor helped tremendously. She introduced me to other women who'd faced similar challenges with exploitative family members. I discovered that I wasn't alone, that financial abuse by adult children was a widespread problem that few people talked about openly. The shame is the worst part, said Margaret, a 80-year-old woman whose daughter had stolen nearly $200,000 over 5 years. You feel stupid for being fooled, guilty for not supporting your child, and embarrassed about the whole situation. "But it's not your fault," added Rose, whose son had forged her signature on loan documents. "These people are experts at manipulation. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push and when to push them." Hearing their stories helped me understand that I hadn't been uniquely gullible or weak. I'd been targeted by someone who understood my vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. The support group also helped me develop practical strategies for maintaining my financial security. I learned about setting up automatic bill payments so I wouldn't be tempted to divert money to family crises. I established a separate savings account that required in-person authorization for withdrawals. I created a written budget that accounted for every dollar of my fixed income. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own judgment again. For years, James had trained me to doubt my perceptions, to second-guess my concerns, to apologize for my legitimate needs. Reclaiming confidence in my own thinking was a slow process, but it was essential for protecting myself from future manipulation. Spring came early that year. By March, I felt strong enough to make some long-overdue changes in my life. I started volunteering again at the literacy program, helping adults learn to read. The work was deeply satisfying, reminding me that I had valuable skills and knowledge to share with others. I also began taking better care of my physical health. I joined a senior fitness class at the community center and started walking in the park near my apartment. For the first time in years, I was investing in my own longevity instead of sacrificing my well-being for someone else's immediate gratification. The financial recovery was slower. $90,000 represented nearly a decade of careful saving, and at my age, rebuilding that kind of security would be challenging. But I was no longer hemorrhaging money every month to James's various crises, which meant my modest Social Security payments could actually cover my living expenses with a little left over for small pleasures. I bought myself fresh flowers every week, not because it was practical, but because beauty mattered. I subscribed to magazines I enjoyed instead of generic publications I thought I should read. I even treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant once a month, something I'd considered impossibly extravagant while funding James's lifestyle. These small indulgences weren't about the money they cost. They were about reclaiming my right to prioritize my own happiness, to make choices based on what brought me joy rather than what solved someone else's problems. But James wasn't done trying to regain access to my assets. His next attempt came in April, 6 months after our kitchen confrontation. I was coming home from the grocery store when I found him sitting on the front steps of my building. He looked terrible, thin, unshaven, exhausted. When he saw me, he stood up quickly. "Mom, thank God. I've been waiting for hours." My first instinct was alarm. Despite everything that had happened, seeing my son in obvious distress triggered all my maternal protective instincts. "James, what's wrong? You look awful." "I am awful. I'm completely destroyed. Mom, I've lost everything." He proceeded to tell me a story of spectacular financial and personal collapse. His business had failed catastrophically, leaving him with massive debts. His girlfriend had left him, taking their shared savings. His landlord had not only evicted him but was pursuing legal action for back rent. He was living in his car, showering at a gym, eating one meal a day. The story was devastating and detailed and completely designed to trigger my guilt and fear. If it was true, my son was experiencing every parent's nightmare: homelessness, destitution, desperation. If it was true. "James," I said carefully, "this is a terrible situation. Have you contacted social services? Are there shelters you can stay in while you get back on your feet?" He looked at me as if I'd suggested he set himself on fire. "Shelters? Mom, I'm not sleeping in some homeless shelter with drug addicts and criminals. I'm your son. I just need enough money to get an apartment and start over. 15,000 would be enough to get me stable, and then I swear I'll pay you back every penny." $15,000. On top of the 90,000 he'd already taken. Plus whatever he'd managed to extract from other sources in the months since I'd cut him off. "I don't have $15,000 to give you," I said. "Yes, you do. You have Dad's life insurance money. You have your savings. You're just being stubborn and vindictive because you're angry at me." The assumption that my financial resources belonged to him was breathtaking. Even in his supposed desperation, James felt entitled to dictate how I used my money. "James, you've already had nearly $90,000 of Dad's life insurance money. That was my security for my old age, and it's gone. That wasn't a gift. That was an investment in my future. Our future. If you'd been patient, if you hadn't suddenly turned paranoid and controlling, we'd both be financially secure right now." Even now, even after months of separation, James was still trying to gaslight me into believing that his exploitation had been for my benefit. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been deceived by his stories before. I had clarity now, and experience, and the support of people who cared about my well-being. "James, I'm sorry you're having difficulties. But I can't help you financially. I've already given you more money than I could afford, and it didn't solve your problems then. It won't solve them now. His expression hardened. So that's it? Your own son is homeless and desperate, and you're going to turn your back on me. I'm not turning my back on you. I'm offering to help you connect with appropriate resources, social services, job placement agencies, housing assistance programs. But I can't keep giving you money that you don't repay for problems that you don't solve. Those programs are for people who don't have family. I have family. I have a mother who's supposed to take care of me. There it was again, the assumption that being his mother meant being his personal welfare system, regardless of the cost to my own security or dignity. James, you're 42 years old. Taking care of you doesn't mean funding your entire lifestyle indefinitely. It does when I'm in crisis. It does when I need help. That's what parents do for their children. What do children do for their parents? The question seemed to surprise him. He stared at me for a moment, as if he'd never considered that parent-child relationships might involve reciprocal obligations. What do you mean? I mean, what have you done for me lately? When was the last time you asked about my health, my finances, my emotional well-being? When was the last time you offered to help me with anything, groceries, housework, companionship? When was the last time you called just to check on me, with no crisis to report and no money to request? James was quiet for a long time. Around us, the city hummed with late afternoon activity. People walked by carrying grocery bags and briefcases, everyone busy with the ordinary business of their lives. I don't have time for social calls when I'm fighting for survival, he said finally. You've been fighting for survival for 3 years. At what point do I stop being your solution and start being something else? Your mother, maybe? Another long silence. I could see James calculating, trying to find the right emotional lever to change my mind. But I was tired of being an equation he was trying to solve. I was tired of being a resource instead of a person. I have to go, I said. But James, there are people who can help you. Real help, not just money. Let me give you some phone numbers. I pulled a piece of paper from my purse and wrote down the contact information for several social service agencies Eleanor had mentioned. James looked at the paper like I was offering him a poisonous snake. I'm not calling those places. I'm not begging strangers for help when my own mother could solve this problem with one phone call to her bank. And there it was, the expectation that I should impoverish myself to save him from the consequences of his own choices, the assumption that my money was really his money, the belief that being his mother meant sacrificing my security for his comfort. Goodbye, James, I said, and walked into my building. He didn't follow me. But as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I could hear him on the sidewalk, shouting about ungrateful mothers and selfish old women who cared more about money than family. The neighbors probably heard him. They probably thought I was a terrible person for refusing to help my obviously desperate son. I didn't care. For the first time in my adult life, I cared more about protecting myself than about what other people thought of my choices. That evening, I called Eleanor to talk through what had happened. How do you feel? She asked. Sad, I said honestly. And relieved. And guilty. And proud of myself. All at the same time. That sounds about right. Setting boundaries with exploitative family members is always emotionally complicated. Do you think I did the right thing? Martha, you've given him $90,000 over 3 years, and his problems have only gotten worse. At what point would it be enough? At what point would you have given him so much that his problems would finally be solved? I considered the question seriously. Would 100,000 have been enough? 200,000? My entire life savings? The answer was obvious. There would never be enough money to solve James's problems because James's problems weren't really about money. They were about his refusal to take responsibility for his own life, his expectation that other people would rescue him from difficult situations, his sense of entitlement to resources he hadn't earned. Giving him more money wouldn't change those fundamental character issues. It would just enable them while impoverishing me. You're right, I said. There would never be enough. And you're 72 years old. You don't have unlimited resources or unlimited time to keep funding his choices. You deserve to feel secure in your own life. Eleanor's words gave me permission to prioritize my own needs, something I'd forgotten how to do after years of putting James's crises first. Summer arrived with unusual gentleness that year. I spent many evenings on the small balcony outside my apartment, reading library books and watching the sun set over the Queen's skyline. The simple pleasure of reading for enjoyment rather than escape felt like a small miracle. I'd also started attending a watercolor painting class at the community center. My paintings were terrible, shaky flowers and lopsided houses that looked like they'd been drawn by an enthusiastic child. But the instructor, a patient woman named Maria, insisted that skill wasn't the point. The point is joy, she said. The point is taking time to notice beauty, to create something with your own hands, to be present in the moment instead of worried about the past or the future. It was the best advice I'd received in years. The painting class introduced me to a social circle I never knew I'd been missing. The other students were mostly women my age, retirees exploring interests they'd deferred while raising families and managing careers. We bonded over our terrible technique and our shared amazement at how good it felt to be bad at something without consequences. I spent 40 years being competent, said Barbara, whose husband had died the year before. It's liberating to be incompetent at something that doesn't matter. We started meeting for coffee after class, then organizing group trips to art museums and local galleries. For the first time since David's death, I had a social life that wasn't organized around my children's needs and crises. But James wasn't done trying to regain access to my assets. His next attempt was more sophisticated than his previous ones, and it caught me completely off guard. It came in the form of a phone call from a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Williams, a social worker with the city's Adult Protective Services Division. Mrs. Henderson, she said in a concerned, professional voice, we've received reports that you may be experiencing some cognitive difficulties and that your family is worried about your ability to manage your financial affairs independently. My blood ran cold. What kind of reports? According to the information we've received, you've recently made some uncharacteristic decisions regarding your finances, and your son is concerned that you may be developing dementia or another condition that's affecting your judgment. The sophistication of the manipulation was breathtaking. James had contacted a government agency and convinced them that I was becoming incompetent, presumably so that he could be appointed as my financial guardian and regain access to my accounts. Dr. Williams, I can assure you that I'm completely competent to manage my own affairs. I've recently taken steps to protect my finances from exploitation, which may be why my son is concerned. There was a pause. Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to meet with me for a brief assessment? It would help us close this case and ensure that you're receiving appropriate support. I agreed to the meeting, but I also immediately called Eleanor for advice. This is a new level of manipulation, she said grimly. Involving government agencies to regain access to your money shows that James is escalating his tactics. Eleanor accompanied me to the meeting with Dr. Williams the next week. The assessment was thorough but not invasive, a series of questions about my daily routines, my financial management, my social connections, my physical and mental health. It quickly became clear that I was anything but incompetent. I was articulate, well-informed about my circumstances, and obviously capable of making rational decisions about my own life. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Williams said at the end of our conversation, there's clearly no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. You seem to be managing your affairs quite well. Thank you. Can I ask what specific concerns my son raised? Dr. Williams consulted her notes. He reported that you'd recently become suspicious and paranoid, making accusations against family members, isolating yourself socially, and making what he characterized as irrational financial decisions. The accusations I made were based on evidence. I found my son accessing my bank accounts without permission. The financial decisions involved protecting my money from further exploitation. As for social isolation, I've actually become more social recently, not less. I see. And can you tell me about your relationship with your son? I told her. I explained about the $90,000, the broken promises, the discovered lies, the attempted manipulation through government agencies. I showed her documentation of my financial losses and my recent steps to protect my remaining assets. Dr. Williams took notes throughout my explanation, her expression growing increasingly serious. Mrs. Henderson, what you're describing sounds like financial exploitation, not cognitive decline. Have you considered filing a report with the police? The suggestion hadn't occurred to me. Despite everything James had done, I'd continued to think of him as my troubled son rather than as a criminal who'd been systematically stealing from me. No, I hadn't considered that. Financial elder abuse is a serious crime. Based on what you've told me, there may be grounds for criminal charges as well as civil recovery of your losses. Dr. Williams provided me with contact information for legal resources specializing in elder financial abuse. She also documented in her report that I was fully competent and that the concerns raised about my mental capacity appeared to be motivated by financial rather than medical considerations. Will my son be informed about the results of this assessment? I asked. He'll be told that our investigation found no evidence of diminished capacity and that no further intervention is needed. He won't receive details about our conversation. After Dr. Williams left, Eleanor and I sat in my kitchen processing what had happened. He tried to have you declared incompetent, Eleanor said. Do you understand how serious that is? If he'd succeeded, you could have lost control of your entire life, your finances, your living situation, your medical decisions. The full implications of James's latest manipulation attempt were staggering. He hadn't just been trying to steal more money, He'd been trying to steal my autonomy, my independence, my basic human rights. What kind of person does that to their own mother? I asked. Eleanor's expression was sad but unsurprised. Someone who sees their parent as an obstacle to overcome rather than as a person to love and protect. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her what had happened. Her reaction was immediate and furious. He reported you to Adult Protective Services? He tried to have you declared incompetent? Mom, that's evil. I don't think he sees it that way. I think he genuinely believes he's entitled to my money and that I'm being unreasonable by protecting it. That doesn't make it less evil. That makes it more evil, because he's so narcissistic he can't see how damaged his thinking is. Sarah offered again to fly out from California to support me through what was clearly becoming a more serious conflict. I think I need to handle this myself, I said. But thank you for offering. Are you going to file criminal charges? It was a question I'd been avoiding since my meeting with Dr. Williams. Filing charges against James would make our conflict public and permanent. It would probably destroy any possibility of future reconciliation. It would force me to acknowledge, legally and formally, that my own son was a criminal who had victimized me. But it would also send a clear message that his behavior had consequences, that I was a person worthy of protection under the law, that his sense of entitlement to my resources was not shared by society at large. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I need to think about it. But even as I said the words, I knew I was already leaning toward taking legal action. James's attempt to have me declared incompetent had crossed a line I didn't know existed. He'd tried to steal not just my money but my freedom, my dignity, my fundamental right to control my own life. That level of betrayal couldn't be ignored or forgiven or explained away as a temporary lapse in judgment. The decision crystallized a few days later when James called me directly for the first time in months. Mom, I heard some social worker came to see you. What was that about? The casual tone was jarring. He was pretending that he didn't know exactly what the visit was about, that he hadn't been the one to initiate the investigation. James, you know exactly what it was about because you're the one who contacted Adult Protective Services. A pause. Then, I was worried about you. You've been acting so strange lately, making all these paranoid accusations. I thought maybe you needed help. You thought maybe you could have me declared incompetent so you could access my finances. That's not. Mom, you're being paranoid again. I was genuinely concerned about your mental health. The gaslighting was automatic and immediate. Even caught in an obvious lie, James was trying to make me doubt my own perception of reality. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been confused by his manipulations before. I had clarity now, and experience, and evidence. James, the social worker, found no evidence of cognitive impairment. She did, however, find evidence of financial exploitation. She suggested I might want to file criminal charges. The silence that followed was telling. If James had genuinely been concerned about my mental health, he would have been relieved to hear that I was competent. Instead, he was clearly processing the implications of my threat to involve law enforcement. You wouldn't do that, he said finally. Why wouldn't I? Because I'm your son. Because you love me. Because you wouldn't want to destroy our family over money. It was the same manipulation he'd used for years, the suggestion that protecting myself from his exploitation was somehow an act of betrayal against him and our family. But I understood now that James had already destroyed our family. He destroyed it when he chose to see me as a financial resource rather than as his mother. He destroyed it when he decided that his needs mattered more than my security. He destroyed it when he tried to have me declared legally incompetent so he could steal my remaining assets. James, you destroyed our family when you started stealing from me. Filing criminal charges wouldn't cause the destruction, it would acknowledge the destruction that's already happened. I never stole anything from you. You gave me that money. I gave you money based on lies. That's called fraud, and it's a crime. Another long pause. I could almost hear James recalculating, trying to find a new approach that would get him what he wanted. Mom, let's meet somewhere and talk this through like civilized people. There's obviously been some misunderstandings, but I'm sure we can work things out. The only thing I want from you, James, is for you to leave me alone. Stop calling me, stop coming to my apartment, stop contacting government agencies about me, stop involving your sister and niece and nephew in our conflict. And if I do that, you'll drop the criminal charges idea? I haven't filed criminal charges yet. But I'm seriously considering it. Mom, please. You don't understand what that would do to me. A criminal record would ruin my life. I'd never be able to get a decent job or rent an apartment or rebuild my life. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of maternal sympathy. The thought of my son facing criminal consequences for his actions activated every protective instinct I'd developed over 42 years of loving him. But then I remembered something Dr. Williams had said: financial elder abuse is a serious crime because it targets the most vulnerable members of our society. The victims are often too ashamed or too loyal to their abusers to seek justice. I was 72 years old, living on a fixed income, with limited resources to rebuild what James had taken from me. If anyone qualified as vulnerable, it was me. And James had specifically targeted my vulnerability, my love for him, my fear of loneliness, my desire to be useful to my children. He'd weaponized my maternal devotion against me. Why should I protect him from the consequences of deliberately victimizing me? James, you should have thought about the potential consequences before you decided to steal from your elderly mother. I didn't steal. Yes, you did. You took $90,000 under false pretenses. You accessed my bank accounts without permission. You tried to have me declared incompetent so you could control my finances. In any other context, with any other victim, you'd already be in jail. The harshness of my words surprised me, but they were also liberating. For the first time in our relationship, I was speaking to James as if his actions had real consequences, as if he were responsible for his choices, as if he were an adult who should be held accountable for his behavior. Fine, James said, his voice cold with anger. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to come running when you're dying alone in some nursing home. It was his final threat, the ultimate punishment he could inflict for my refusal to enable his exploitation, abandonment in my most vulnerable moments. Once, that threat would have terrified me into compliance. The fear of dying alone, unloved and unvisited, would have sent me running to the bank to transfer whatever funds he needed. But I understood now that James had never been offering genuine love and support. He'd been offering a transaction, his presence in exchange for my money. And when the money stopped flowing, his presence had already disappeared. I was already alone. At least now I was alone with dignity. Goodbye, James, I said, and hung up the phone. 2 days later, I met with a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse. Her name was Patricia Chong, and she had 20 years of experience helping seniors recover assets from exploitative family members. Based on what you've told me, she said after reviewing my documentation, you have a strong case for both criminal charges and civil recovery. The pattern of deception, the amounts involved, and the recent attempt to have you declared incompetent all support claims of elder financial abuse. What would be involved in pursuing this legally? Criminal charges would be filed by the district attorney's office based on your complaint. The prosecution would be handled by the state, you wouldn't need to pay for that. Civil recovery would involve suing your son for the return of the money he took from you, plus damages and legal fees. What are the chances of actually getting my money back? Ms. Chang's expression was cautious. That depends on your son's financial situation. If he's genuinely destitute, as he claims, there may not be any assets to recover. But if he has hidden assets or income, we might be able to locate and seize them. And what would this do to him personally? If convicted on criminal charges, he could face jail time, probation, and restitution orders. If we win a civil judgment, his assets could be seized, his wages garnished, and his credit destroyed. These are serious consequences. I thought about James's threat to abandon me if I pursued legal action. Then I thought about the years of manipulation, the lies, the broken promises, the systematic erosion of my financial security. Most importantly, I thought about the woman I'd become through this process, someone who valued her own dignity, who protected her own interests, who refused to allow others to exploit her generosity. That woman wouldn't hesitate to seek justice when she'd been wronged. Let's do it, I said. Let's file both criminal and civil charges. Ms. Chong nodded approvingly. I think you're making the right choice. These cases are about more than money, they're about establishing that elderly people have the right to be treated with respect and dignity by their own families. The legal process moved slowly but steadily over the following months. The criminal complaint was filed first, leading to James's arrest on charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, and identity theft. The arrest was humiliating for him, and I'll admit to feeling a dark satisfaction when Ms. Chong called to tell me about it. James was released on bail but ordered to have no contact with me pending trial. The no-contact order was a relief. For the first time in 4 years, I knew I wouldn't have to deal with his manipulation, his crises, his demands for money. The civil lawsuit was filed shortly after, seeking recovery of the $90,000 plus damages and legal fees. Ms. Chang's investigators discovered that James did have some assets he'd been hiding, a small investment account funded by money he'd taken from other family members, and a partial ownership stake in a friend's business. But the most satisfying discovery was evidence that James had been running similar scams on other family members and elderly neighbors. My case had exposed a pattern of predatory behavior that had victimized multiple people. Your son is what we call a career financial predator, Ms. Chong explained. He's made a lifestyle out of exploiting people who care about him. Taking legal action protects not just you, but other potential victims. The knowledge that I was potentially protecting others from James's manipulation made me feel even more confident about my decision to seek justice. The criminal trial was scheduled for early the following spring. In the months leading up to it, I focused on rebuilding my life and my financial security. With James's manipulation removed from my daily existence, I discovered reserves of energy and creativity I'd forgotten I possessed. I took on more volunteer work at the Literacy Center and even started mentoring other seniors who'd been victimized by financial exploitation. "Your story gives me hope," said Dorothy, a 78-year-old woman whose daughter had stolen her entire retirement savings. "If you can fight back and win, maybe I can too." Helping other victims became a source of meaning and purpose I hadn't expected. My own painful experience had given me insights and strategies that could benefit others facing similar challenges. Eleanor and I also deepened our friendship. She became the family I'd chosen rather than the family I'd been born with, someone who valued my well-being, supported my decisions, and offered companionship without conditions or expectations. "Do you regret taking legal action against James?" she asked one evening as we shared dinner at a restaurant overlooking the East River. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret holding my son accountable for stealing from me? Did I regret refusing to enable his exploitation? Did I regret choosing my own dignity over his convenience? No, I said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that he made choices that led to this outcome. But I don't regret protecting myself. "Good," Eleanor said. "You deserve protection, even if you have to provide it yourself." As winter turned to spring, I received word that James had agreed to a plea bargain in criminal court. He would plead guilty to elder financial abuse and fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, 2 years of probation, community service, and a restitution order for the full $90,000. The restitution order meant that James would be required to repay me, with his wages garnished if necessary until the debt was satisfied. It also meant that his crime would be on his permanent record, making it harder for him to victimize others in the future. The civil lawsuit was settled around the same time. Between James's hidden assets and the criminal restitution order, Miss Chong was confident that I would eventually recover most of the money he'd stolen. "It may take several years," she warned me, "and you may not get every penny back. But you'll get justice, and you'll get most of your financial security restored." More importantly, I'd gotten my self-respect back. I'd proven to myself that I was a person worthy of protection, that my needs mattered, that I didn't have to tolerate exploitation even from someone I loved. On a warm April morning, I sat in my lawyer's office signing the final settlement papers. Outside the window, New York City was coming alive with spring energy, trees budding, flowers blooming, people shedding their winter coats and embracing the promise of renewal. "How do you feel?" Miss Chong asked as I signed my name for the last time. "Free," I said. And for the first time in years, I truly was. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since David died. I went shopping for something beautiful and completely unnecessary. I bought myself a silk scarf in shades of blue and green that reminded me of the ocean. I bought fresh flowers for my apartment. I bought an expensive bottle of wine to celebrate. When I got home, I called Sarah to share the news about the settlement. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "You fought for yourself when no one else would. You protected yourself when no one else could." "I had good support," I said, thinking of Eleanor and Ms. Chong and all the people who'd helped me through the darkest period of my life. "But you had to make the hard choices. You had to be brave when it would have been easier to just give in." Sarah was right. Every step of this process had required me to choose courage over convenience, justice over false peace, self-respect over family loyalty. Those choices had been painful and scary and sometimes lonely. But they'd also been necessary and right and ultimately liberating. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and the evening newspaper. The sun was setting over Queens, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The city hummed with life around me, but for once, I felt like I belonged in the symphony instead of being drowned out by it. My phone rang. For a moment, my heart jumped. Some part of me still expected it to be James, despite the no-contact order. But when I looked at the screen, I saw Emma's name. "Hi, Grandma Martha," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom said we can come visit you this summer. Can we go to museums and ride the subway and eat pizza?" "Of course, sweetheart. We can do all of those things." "Will Uncle James be there too?" It was a question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her uncle is a criminal who stole from her grandmother? How do you help a child understand that sometimes the people we love hurt us in ways that can't be forgiven? "No, honey. Uncle James won't be there. He and I are having some grown-up problems that we need to work out separately." "Oh. Well, that's okay. I just want to spend time with you." The simple acceptance in her voice reminded me why I'd fought so hard to protect myself. It wasn't just about money or pride or principle. It was about being present and stable and secure enough to be a good grandmother, a reliable friend, a contributing member of my community. James's exploitation hadn't just stolen my money, it had stolen my peace of mind, my ability to focus on anything other than his latest crisis, my capacity to be fully present for the people who genuinely cared about me. By refusing to continue enabling him, I'd reclaimed not just my financial security but my emotional availability for the relationships that were actually based on love rather than exploitation. After I hung up with Emma, I sat in the gathering darkness thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been a victim, isolated, manipulated, and slowly drained of everything that made life worth living. Tonight, I was a survivor, connected, empowered, and actively building a future I could look forward to. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick or without cost. I'd lost my son, at least temporarily and possibly permanently. I'd been forced to confront painful truths about the person I'd raised and loved unconditionally. But I'd gained something more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained myself. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray hair and wrinkles and all the signs of 7 decades of living. But she also had something that had been missing for years, a spark of life in her eyes, a sense of purpose in her posture, a quiet confidence that said she knew her own worth. I liked that woman. I respected her. I was proud of what she'd accomplished. For the first time since David's death, I was proud to be me. 6 months later, I received a letter from James. It was brief and awkward, clearly written at the suggestion of his probation officer or therapist. "Mom, I want you to know that I understand I hurt you and that what I did was wrong. I'm working on myself and trying to make better choices. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry." I read the letter several times, looking for signs of genuine remorse or understanding. What I found was the bare minimum of acknowledgement required to fulfill some legal or therapeutic obligation. There was no real insight into how his actions had affected me, no recognition of the years of manipulation and lies that had preceded the outright theft, no indication that he understood the difference between being sorry he got caught and being sorry he'd chosen to victimize me. I showed the letter to Eleanor over coffee. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think it's exactly what I'd expect from someone who's learned to say the right words without necessarily meaning them," she said. "The question is, what do you want to do with it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to respond, to tell him that I appreciate the apology and that maybe we can work toward rebuilding some kind of relationship. And what does the other part of you want?" I thought about it carefully. The other part of me thinks that responding would just restart a cycle of communication that would eventually lead back to manipulation and exploitation. Eleanor nodded. "Both of those reactions are understandable. But you don't have to decide right now. You can take all the time you need to figure out what feels right for you." I carried the letter around for weeks, pulling it out occasionally to reread and reconsider. Eventually, I realized that I was spending more time thinking about James's needs and feelings than about my own, the same pattern that had made me vulnerable to his exploitation in the first place. So I stopped thinking about what James needed from me and started thinking about what I needed for myself. What I needed was continued peace, security, and freedom from manipulation. What I needed was to maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. What I needed was to protect the new life I'd built from the chaos that James brought wherever he went. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I filed it away and focused on the plans I was making for the future. Those plans included a trip to California to visit Sarah and the grandchildren. It would be my first vacation in over a decade, funded by money I'd saved by not giving it to James for his various emergencies. I was also considering moving to a smaller apartment in a building with more senior-friendly amenities. The idea of downsizing, of creating a space that was entirely suited to my needs and preferences, felt like the ultimate expression of my newfound independence. Most excitingly, I'd been asked to speak at a conference for social workers about financial elder abuse from the victim's perspective. The idea of turning my painful experience into education that might help others was deeply fulfilling. "You have a unique perspective," the conference organizer had told me. "Most victims of elder financial abuse don't have the courage or resources to fight back successfully. Your story could inspire others and help professionals understand what victims go through." On the morning I delivered my speech, I stood in front of an audience of social workers, lawyers, and law enforcement officers and told them about the 4 hours I'd spent waiting for James at Grand Central Station, about finding him at my computer trying to access my bank accounts, about the years of manipulation and exploitation that had preceded that moment of clarity. I told them about the shame and confusion that had kept me isolated and vulnerable. I told them about the strength I'd found in unexpected places, in new friendships, in legal advocacy, in the simple act of choosing to protect myself. Most importantly, I told them about the transformation that was possible when victims of elder abuse were supported in fighting back instead of encouraged to keep the peace. The most important thing I learned, I said in closing, is that love shouldn't bankrupt you. Family shouldn't exploit you. And being someone's mother doesn't mean being their endless source of funds. The audience gave me a standing ovation, but the real reward was the conversations I had afterward with people who'd been touched by similar experiences. My mother went through exactly the same thing with my brother, one social worker told me. She never fought back, and she died broke and heartbroken. Thank you for showing that there's another way. Driving home from the conference, I thought about the woman who'd sat on that cold bench at Grand Central Station 3 years earlier. She'd been defeated, confused, and slowly disappearing under the weight of someone else's problems. The woman driving home today was confident, purposeful, and fully present in her own life. The transformation between those two versions of myself felt like the most significant accomplishment of my 75 years on Earth. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, I saw Eleanor waiting for me on the front steps. She was holding a bottle of champagne and a bouquet of flowers. "I wanted to celebrate your speech," she said as I approached. "And to thank you for being an inspiration to all of us." We went upstairs to my apartment and opened the champagne. As we toasted my successful presentation, Eleanor raised a question I'd been avoiding. "Have you thought about what you'll do if James contacts you directly when his probation is over?" It was a fair question. The no-contact order was temporary, and James would eventually be free to reach out to me if he chose to. "I think I'll handle each situation as it comes," I said. "But I'll never forget what I learned through this process, that I have the right to protect myself, even from people I love. And if he's genuinely changed? If he's learned to treat you with respect?" I considered the possibility. Was there a version of the future where James and I could have a healthy relationship? Where he could be in my life without exploiting or manipulating me? "If he's genuinely changed, he'll prove it through his actions over time," I said. "He'll respect my boundaries, he'll rebuild trust slowly and patiently, and he'll accept that our relationship can never go back to the way it was before. And if he hasn't changed? Then I'll protect myself the same way I did before. I know now that I can survive without his love if that love comes with conditions that compromise my dignity." Eleanor smiled and raised her glass. "To Martha," she said, "who learned to love herself as much as she loves others." We drank to that, and as the champagne bubbled on my tongue, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had been painful and scary and sometimes lonely. But it had also been necessary and ultimately liberating. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I deserved better treatment than I'd been accepting, and that it was never too late to start protecting the life I'd built and the peace I'd earned. Most importantly, I'd learned that love, real love, doesn't come with price tags or conditions or endless crises that need solving. Real love accepts boundaries, respects dignity, and supports the well-being of everyone involved. As the sun set over Queens that evening, I sat on my balcony with a renewed sense of possibility. I was 75 years old, and for the first time in years, the future felt full of potential rather than obligation. Tomorrow, I would continue building the life I wanted rather than the life others expected me to fund. I would nurture relationships that enriched rather than diminished me. I would make choices based on my own values rather than other people's crises. Tomorrow, and every day after that, I would remember that my life belonged to me. And that was worth fighting for. Now, as I sit here sharing this story with you, I want you to know that if any of this sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself in my experience of being slowly drained by someone who claims to love you, you're not alone, and you're not powerless. It took me years to understand that protecting myself wasn't selfish, that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, that saying no wasn't abandonment. But once I learned those lessons, my entire life changed. You deserve to be treated with respect by every person in your life, including your family members. You deserve to have your generosity appreciated rather than exploited. You deserve to feel secure in your own life rather than constantly worried about someone else's crises. And you deserve to know that it's never too late to start protecting what matters most, your dignity, your peace of mind, and your right to live your remaining years on your own terms. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you loved was taking advantage of your kindness? Have you ever wondered if you were being too generous with someone who never seemed to appreciate your sacrifices? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is share our stories and realize we're not alone in our struggles. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own experiences, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these difficult truths helps create a community where people feel supported in making the hard choices that protect their well-being. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for giving me the space to share what I learned through one of the most difficult periods of my life. And thank you for reminding me that even our deepest pain can become a source of strength and connection when we have the courage to speak our truth.